if we're looking at the Russian-Ukrainian conflict sort of en masse, going back to its beginning foundation, for Russia at least, it starts with the Maidan Revolution, or even the precursors to what created the Maidan Revolution. And that's something that we get a little bit of a debate or a discussion in the West about. The Russians feel that the West sort of made some sneaky promises behind the scenes to Ukraine, the people who would ultimately lead this revolution and cause the sitting president to flee to Russia and have a new president come in and take his place, who was much more EU-friendly, much more NATO-friendly, much less Russian-friendly. The Russians always saw some subterfuge in that action. They never saw it as a natural, organic revolution. They always saw it as an example of Western interference. And they therefore felt justified to say, well, if you can interfere, we're going to interfere. Because if you're just playing out your interests on the ground in Ukraine, why can't we play out our interests on the ground in Ukraine? Besides, we also think Ukraine is a better partner to us, should be a bigger compatriot of our interests, because we have religious, cultural, historical ties. No matter how you try to play it in the West, Ukraine and Russia should not be at odds against each other. Ukraine and Russia should not be enemies. They are the more natural allies. And in the end, since you're making false promises, we're going to find out how much you really mean it when you tell Ukraine secretly, whisper behind our backs, that don't listen to Russia, don't do anything about Russia, come to us instead. Ukraine really believed in that. The people who led the Maidan Revolution believed that would happen. So then when that sort of, what we call the annexation of Crimea, but yet in Russia they call the secession of Crimea into the Russian Federation, because the people in Crimea held a referendum saying we want to be part of Russia, we don't want to be part of Ukraine anymore. We portray that as being Russia forced that on Crimea. The Russians say the Crimeans voiced their political will, and we back them up, which is what you guys in the West didn't do for Ukraine when we did it. What's above the Kerch Strait, which never gets played in Western media, is this massive 8-lane superhighway that actually the Russians built and had actually in place as an agreement and was already begun to be built before the Maidan Revolution and is now complete. What it does is it connects, as a land bridge, it connects from Rostov in Russia over into Crimea, so that you don't have to go through Ukraine at all to get into Crimea. That's where those naval vessels were. That's where the Russians, they were getting near the bridge without any knowledge or any announcement, anything preordained. So the Russians said, what are you doing here? The Ukrainians don't answer. And the Russians start playing with it. They say, well, we'll see how tough you really are. Are you really going to use these naval ships? Are you really going to do an action here? That's why the Russians call it a provocation. And in the West, we say the Russians are just making up the word provocations because these vessels weren't doing anything. But we're ignoring how the perspective of the Russians near this massive land bridge that literally now connects Russia to Crimea, how would they interpret the presence of military vessels unannounced with no declared plan of action, just this sort of mysterious presence? They did what most countries probably would do, but what they did goes against our interests, so therefore we have a problem with Russia's actions. Russia has seen, really quite frankly, since the 90s with Clinton, this sort of slow, very gradual encroachment where more and more members of what they used to consider their sphere of influence or their regional neighborhood, the Russian regional neighborhood, more and more people become part of NATO. But the one part they've always laid out is like the parts that have always sort of been Russian, right? And you can't underestimate what Ukraine means to Russians in their memory as far as their historical, cultural, and even religious memory. That area, Ukraine and Russia, has always been tied together. So that might be the red line, no pun intended, for the Russians, drawn in the sand about Ukraine will not go to NATO. We will stand up against that. And I think maybe the possibility was that NATO thought, well, let's test that a little bit. Because maybe they're saying it. Of course, we understand why you say it. We need some machismo on that. You need some bravado on that. But let's see if you really mean it. And as it turns out, the Russians said, yeah, we do really mean it. Now, do you really mean it? Are you really going to come to bat for Ukraine if we step up? They stepped up, we stepped back. That sounds bad, but it's not World War III and won't be World War III because it means the two big sides, the two big players, Russia and the United States, are declaring Ukraine is enough for us to get into hissy fights over. It's not enough for us to get into a real war with each other over. And that's the part that's going unsaid in the West that we should emphasize more.